A very warm welcome, everyone, to those here in person at the OECD and to all those joining our live broadcast today from around the world. My name is Axel Threlfall. I'm the editor-at-large at Reuters, and I will be your host and your moderator over the next few hours. Today's event marks the commemoration of the 60th anniversary of the signing of the OECD Convention, just a stone's throw from where we're sitting now, on the 14th of December, 1960. Today we pay tribute to the history of an organization whose roots lie in the Marshall Plan and post-war reconstruction. But importantly, today is also about our present and our future. The COVID crisis, the recovery, the priorities for building back better, the challenges and opportunities facing multilateralism, and the role the OECD plays in all of the above. We have a really busy and a very compelling agenda ahead. As I mentioned, this is a live event being broadcast from the OECD headquarters in Paris. There is an impressive number of leaders with us here in person, testament to the significance and indeed the importance of today's event. We will also be joined virtually, but still live, by leaders from several other OECD member countries, and others have sent video messages to mark this occasion that will be played out during proceedings. We have 3 leaders' panel discussions lined up for you, an opportunity to really dig, I think, a little deeper into some of the issues on the table. And as we all know, there are plenty of big, critical issues that we need to discuss. This is being billed as a leaders event, but many other voices will be heard in a number of different sessions this week, as well as through social media and the OECD website. Okay, enough from me for the time being. To kick off this event, I'd like to introduce a short commemorative video compiled by the OECD that details some of the milestones of the past 60 years.
The OECD is marking its 60th anniversary in uncertain and troubled times. The COVID-19 pandemic changed our world in 2020 and poses a challenge for us all as we try to save lives, jobs, and our communities. The OECD itself emerged from a crisis, and we have overcome others. We know from experience that we will get through this one. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development was created 60 years ago to bring countries together to promote the economic and social well-being of their peoples and spread the promise of cooperation and development throughout the world. Our countries reached out to each other for trade and investment, to learn from one another and share ideas and best practices. The OECD forged groundbreaking standards to raise the bar and level the playing field, to enable our countries to advance together. We urged reforms, established the Anti-Bribery Convention, guidelines for multinational businesses, norms for financial support and development assistance, and a polluter pays principle before anyone knew our climate was changing. We were ahead of the curve on the digital economy too, issuing guidelines to protect personal data before the internet age. Our joint efforts brought stability and prosperity and drew our world closer together. The OECD went global, welcoming in new members and worked alongside many countries. We entered the new millennium feeling buoyant, connected and confident. But then came the 2008 crisis. The collapse of financial markets shook our world. Globalization had benefited the lucky few. Working people, from the lowest earners to the squeezed middle class, felt betrayed and left out. Change was needed. We took a long, hard look at ourselves and charted a bold new course. With our member countries, our partners, business and labor leaders, international organizations, and our increasingly diverse stakeholder community, into a decade of transformation to forge better policies for better lives and a stronger, cleaner, fairer world. We widened our membership and built stronger links with the G7, G20, APEC, and the United Nations. And we listened to people constantly through our OECD Forum and our burgeoning media and interactive platforms. We examined what really matters in people's lives and reconnected with our founding mission by going beyond GDP and to put people's well-being at the center. We launched new approaches to economic challenges to challenge our thinking and make policies more resilient and agile. Thanks to our Inclusive Growth Initiative, we sought to bridge divides, focusing on inequalities in wealth and opportunity, the gender gap, and protecting the most vulnerable. We stepped up our fight against tax havens and left nowhere to hide by ending bank secrecy and exposing 84 million offshore accounts worth 10 trillion euros. We took unprecedented steps to ensure multinationals pay their fair share of taxes wherever they do business and supported revenue authorities in developing countries. We promoted responsible business conduct within companies and along their supply chains. And we urged our countries to go green, building on half a century of environmental work to support the Paris Agreement to safeguard our climate and our biodiversity, our planet and the future of our children. To improve education, we took the bedrock of our PISA tests and updated them for teachers and adults in a digital age. Our Going Digital strategy kept us ahead of the technological wave as we addressed the likes of blockchain, forged new principles on artificial intelligence, and laid the ground for the future of work. We transformed to respond to the world's most pressing challenges by integrating our economic, social, and environmental work, pioneering new initiatives on climate, housing, sustainable infrastructure, and making the OECD more impactful. A do tank in tune with the needs of member countries and the global community. Still, COVID-19 caught us off guard, but not off our game. We responded as we've always done, steadying the ship and shifting into gear with timely data and analysis on our coronavirus hub as part of a massive global response to help countries navigate through the crisis and prepare for the future. The pandemic has amplified other critical global challenges we've long faced and has made addressing them more urgent than ever. The crisis has brought us to a moment of truth. No country can address these global challenges alone. Only by acting together, multilaterally, can we overcome them and build our world back better. The OECD, working together, recovering together, imagining together, daring together. That's what we do. That's what we can be proud of and commemorate together.
President Macron, Prime Minister Sanchez, President Michel, General Director Azulé, distinguished guests, it is with enormous pleasure that I welcome you today for this commemoration of the 60th anniversary of the signing of the OECD Convention. The OECD's origins can be traced back to the Marshall Plan, that brilliant demonstration that economies are interlinked and that we have a mutual interest in prosperity for all. That plan gave birth to the European Organization for Economic Cooperation, the EOEC, in 1948, and then to the OECD, its successor, in 1960, representing a collective response to the period of non-cooperation of the 1920s and the 1930s, which had led to the Great Depression, to trade conflicts, and eventually to war.
The OECD was part of a broader effort to entrench a rules-based international order to promote global economic development and improve the well-being of people everywhere. Now, 60 years later, these aspirations still deserve to be celebrated and reaffirmed. During the intervening period, the OECD has established itself as a reference for objective analysis, the sharing of best practices, the production of reliable data, and recommendations for public policies. Remember, our motto is better policies for better lives. This OECD was often ahead of its time. Already in 1971, it established its Environment Directorate. It was actually the first international organization to have an Environment Directorate. Published the first Migration Outlook. Now, that was 44 years ago, and we have been doing that year in and year out. Launched PISA in the year 2000, which became the world's reference for education systems, and warned about inequalities. I remember in 2008, our report, Growing Unequal, with a question mark. Unfortunately, then we had to remove the question mark because we confirmed that we were growing unequal. Now, we celebrated these and other achievements at the 50th anniversary in 2011. But in the 10 years since then, the OECD has continued to advance, continued to evolve, even faster than ever. We've been guided by 5 main objectives. First, we have put people at the center of policymaking. From our inclusive growth, our green growth, our gender initiatives, the creation of the OECD Center for Well-being, Inclusion, Sustainability, and Equal Opportunities, which we call WISE, the WISE Center. The Better Life Index, green growth indicators. In every case, the OECD has led the way in linking policies to the key objective of people's well-being. Second, we have evolved from a think tank to a do tank, helping government design and implement, as I mentioned before, better policies for better lives. Third, we work hard to update and improve our analytical frameworks. The New Approaches to Economic Challenges initiative, otherwise known as NIAC, which grew out of our collective failure to anticipate the global financial crisis in 2008. This NIAC initiative has improved our understanding of systemic risks and has provided us with better indicators for resilience. A fourth key priority has been to develop and strengthen the OECD's standards and to broaden countries' adherence to the standards. It's not enough just to have the standards, then you have to make them stick. The OECD has developed more than 450 legal instruments, many of which have been updated and upgraded and modified. Key recent examples include the OECD Principles on Artificial Intelligence, adopted last year, which were then, by the way, adopted by the G20. So they are the, I suppose, I put the OECD first, no surprise, so OECD G20 principles on artificial intelligence. Then the 2018 Multilateral Convention to implement tax treaty-related measures to prevent what we call the base erosion in profit shifting, the BEPS. We've also worked relentlessly to increase the global reach of the organization. Since 2010, 7 new members have joined, and Costa Rica will soon follow. It'll be the 8th. And 6 countries, Argentina, Brazil, Bulgaria, Croatia, Peru, Romania, they have been waiting almost 4 years for an answer on their request for membership. And by the way, let me use the opportunity of having our leaders here to say to them, we obviously have to give these countries an answer and start them on the process of membership. It takes, after all, 4 to 5 years on average to become a member. Now, we've also identified our engagement with non-members through our work with key partners, our country programs, our regional programs, and the work of what we call our development cluster. We've also, since 2008, intensified our collaboration with the G20 and the G7, and have advanced major international initiatives, like the drive for global tax transparency, the 25 by 25 gender target, and the G20 OECD principles on corporate governance. Now, this progress has been put to the test in the current crisis. And I'm pleased to say that the OECD delivered. The OECD delivered. We have mobilized our multidisciplinary expertise. We bolstered the coordination efforts to help governments limit the impact of the crisis on people, better anticipate uncertain futures, and raise the resilience of both economies and societies. And we have done this through bilateral policy dialogues with leaders, with ministers, through our COVID-19 digital hub, which already has 167 policy briefs, 3 ministerial roundtables in our ministerial council meeting under the leadership of President Sanchez. Again, thank you very much for Spain's and your own leadership, where our members charted a path in this ministerial council meeting. They charted a path towards a strong, resilient, inclusive, sustainable recovery, reflected in the first fully agreed ministerial statement in 4 years. We had not been able to have a ministerial statement agreed among all the members in 4 years. And this time, it was possible. So, chers amis,
dear friends, at this critical juncture where we are thinking about the achievements of the past, we should also look to the future. The challenges to come for this organization and its members are greater than ever. We must not only overcome the present crisis, but also tackle climate change, the challenges threatening biodiversity, the oceans, water. We must deal with the digital transformation and adapt to the aging of our populations and fight against inequalities. As we move forwards together, know that the OECD will remain resolved to work with all stakeholders in order to be able to shape and implement better policies for better lives. Thank you.
President Macron, President Sanchez, now please join me in the unveiling of the plaque for the commemoration of the 60th anniversary of the signing of the OECD Convention.
All right, if everybody could retake their seats, we will continue with the program. Please don't sit down, President Macron. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming President Macron of France to the podium for his keynote remarks.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Secrétaire Général.
Thank you very much, Secretary General.
Monsieur le Président, Conseil des ministres.
President,
Pedro, merci
Ministers,
d'être là. Monsieur
Pedro, thank you for being here.
Européen, cher Charles.
President of
Merci
the
d'être à
Council,
Paris aujourd'hui
thank
après
you for being
plusieurs heures passées
present here in
ensemble à
Paris
Bruxelles la
after
semaine
several
dernière.
hours spent
Directeur
together
général de
in
l'UNESCO.
Brussels last week.
Merci
Director General of UNESCO, thank you for demonstrating the cooperation between the major organizations whose headquarters are in Paris
un lieu
today.
de coopération concrète et
This
d'intelligence
is a demonstration of collective collaboration and intelligence.
Mesdames et messieurs,
Ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, friends, 60 years ago, as you have said, in Paris, 18 European countries, along with Canada and the United States, signed the convention creating the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development.
alors que les fonds du plan Marshall avaient été alloués et
The funds of the Marshall Plan had been allocated and the European Economic Community was beginning to exist thanks to the Treaty of Rome. And at that time, a choice was made to make permanent an international organization dedicated to economic and social progress and cooperation between states sharing the same values.
il faut prendre le temps aujourd'hui
We must take the time today to understand the objectives of the founding fathers of the OECD. That convention of 1960 tells us that our economies and our societies are
Elle
interdependent.
nous dit que la coopération
It tells us
économique et
that
sociale
economic and social cooperation must be at the service of a policy vision. And your slogan here at the OECD demonstrates that perfectly.
les vies meilleures.
That objective was peace and the well-being of peoples for a better life. The convention tells us that economic development must also be at the service of developing countries. This convention of 1960 that we are celebrating today carried within it all of the success of the OECD that we know. That success rests on a proven and remarkably effective method based on three
D'abord des
pillars.
données rigoureuses
First of all, rigorous data
permettant à chaque pays de
enabling each country to compare itself to
des
others.
échanges de meilleures pratiques entre experts
Then the exchange of
et
best
enfin, des
practice among
recommandations
experts. And
générales
finally,
et adaptées.
recommendations both general and tailored to each member state.
Des grands succès ont été
Major successes have been built using this method. Mr. Secretary-General, you have reminded us of those successes, as also did the short video that we saw. I'm thinking of PISA in the field of education, which enables us to measure and to improve our educational attainment. I think, of course, of the work to combat tax evasion, the end of bank secrecy, the fight against corruption. I'm also thinking of the OECD report on climate finance of 2015, which contributed to the success of COP21 and the Paris Agreement. I'm thinking of the standards of the OECD on responsible business conduct, which today are the international reference in this regard. And I think that we must underline the fact that these recent successes owe a lot to you, Mr. Secretary-General, in a context in which multilateralism is criticized for its inability to respond to major contemporary challenges. There is a striking counter-example, and that is the example of this organization, the OECD, which continues to run and to generate results. And so, Mr. Secretary-General, my dear friend, I wanted to address to you the thanks of France for your resolute action at the head of the OECD since 2006. This is also a great source of pride for us, the fact that the OECD has its headquarters here in Paris. France is a fertile terrain welcoming talents from everywhere, including those of the international organizations. Today we are facing the greatest health and economic crisis of the past century. We have not yet emerged from that crisis, but we can already draw several lessons from it for the future. The first of those lessons is that we must be better prepared in terms of health security first. The pandemic has brought to light many deficiencies in our collective preparation and has highlighted the need to pool our resources and our knowledge. And then, in terms of economic resilience, this crisis has revealed an industrial, commercial and financial interdependence of our economies. Our value chains have become increasingly and inextricably interlinked, as we've seen over recent years. Now all of the potential weaknesses that existed before this crisis have been brought to light, and the challenges for our sovereignty. No country must depend on a single partner for supply in its strategic sectors. And so we are all facing what has been revealed about the world of today, the interdependence of our value chains and the need for cooperation. We must avoid nationalism and protectionism. And follow the logic of cooperation. For this, we will need the analyses and the recommendations of the OECD. The second lesson of this crisis is that in order to rise to the great contemporary challenges, states must better coordinate their action. The OECD must continue to be a driving force of multilateralism. Soft law, using the English term, shows the way by encouraging rather than imposing. And this will be very useful in the world of tomorrow. We've seen that facing a worldwide pandemic that reveals our interdependence, facing our vulnerabilities economically and socially. All responses must be coordinated and cooperative, whether we're talking about organizing ourselves to confront the pandemic, whether we talk about vaccines, what we're seeing at the moment through the COVAX initiative, and then in terms of monitoring and follow-up and ensuring the resilience of our health systems, our economies and our societies. The third lesson is that this crisis is accelerating the digitalization of our societies and our economies. On this subject, as we know, we need to continue to accelerate on all fronts. You have begun to help us. We've been talking about this. President Sanchez and I were talking about it earlier. This crisis has revealed that in terms of knowledge, schools, culture, working, our very way of functioning, that we need to accelerate digitalization of our societies. And there, the work of standard setting, of sharing knowledge is essential to help us. And also in this regard, as we know, we need a fairer taxation because this crisis is an accelerating factor for the digitalization of our economies, and therefore it is making even more necessary the need to address the fact that only a handful of digital companies who over recent years have generated huge profits and have only increased those profits over the period of this pandemic. We must make sure that they are paying a fair share of their taxes. This is something that is increasingly unacceptable for our citizens and can only be resolved by cooperation. As you know, France is very committed to the negotiations underway at the OECD and would like to see them conclude at the latest by mid-2021, as the G20 had decided. In terms of digitalization, fair taxation of digital services directed by the OECD is the best response. The fourth lesson is that this crisis and the responses of governments to it constitutes an opportunity to profoundly redirect our economic models and make them greener, more compatible with our challenge of fighting climate disruption and greenhouse gases and protecting biodiversity. At a European level, we have committed to achieving climate neutrality by 2050. Just a few years ago, I announced our objectives for 2030 involving a reduction of 55% of our emissions. But we also know that a great deal of work remains to be done in order to position ourselves effectively on the right trajectory to reach the temperature target of the Paris Agreement. That is the essence of the European recovery plan, our recovery plan, and also the work being done here. We count a great deal on the OECD. Earlier, I mentioned the OECD method, which is so effective in developing public policy. We would like the OECD to put its tools, its method, its effectiveness to the service of our climate ambitions. France launched an important initiative on this subject at the OECD, and I would like to see this work completed rapidly so that we have at our disposal an additional tool for measuring our climate commitments, and which will generate for each and every one of us the recommendations for achieving carbon neutrality in a manner that also supports employment, collective prosperity, and protects the most vulnerable. And a new stage is opening now here, the appropriate measurement of our short-term measures, and there will be a lot of debate on this in the coming months. We're all committed for 2030 and 2050. Our people will legitimately be asking us questions. What stage have you reached? Who is measuring this? Who are the independent authorities monitoring what is happening? We will need to devote all of our expertise to these challenges. The final lesson is that this crisis has worsened the subject that you raised when you talked about the social and economic crisis, inequalities. And that has happened despite our efforts. Inequalities, first of all, between countries. Decades of development progress as a result of the pandemic risk now being called into question. It is urgent for the OECD to provide a sustainable response to help the most vulnerable countries, and particularly those of the African country. I think that this is perhaps our greatest challenge at the moment, how to reduce inequalities between countries in the health sector, but also economically and socially. And this is a pillar of our priorities. We must work together. At a European level, we must work with our African fellow countries. And we also need to tackle inequalities within countries. We must rapidly and robustly remedy these inequalities to guarantee the cohesion of our societies. All stakeholders have a role to play in this regard. First of all, states and public authorities, but also companies, NGOs, social or civil society, and solidarity between citizens. The OECD participated, among other things, by contributing to the Business for Inclusive Growth initiative launched at the G7 summit in Biarritz. The rigor and inventiveness of the OECD will be decisive tomorrow in catalyzing these new coalitions that are game-changing. To accompany the world to emerge from this crisis, we will need, and this is why I mentioned the various lessons to draw from the pandemic today on the occasion of the 60th anniversary, we will need to draw on the philosophy and the effectiveness of this organization. There is no doubt that we are at a turning point in the history of our world. We were at that turning point before the pandemic, and it has been an accelerating factor for the better or for the worse. The demographic crisis, the technological crisis, the climate crisis, the inequalities have been accelerated as a result of the pandemic, have been revealed further during this period. Facing all of this, I believe in science, I believe in facts, I believe in independent expertise rather than in plots and in the manipulation of information. And I believe in cooperation, free, voluntary, intelligent cooperation rather than in a retreat into brutality or nationalism. And these beliefs, I think, are fully incarnated by your organization, Secretary-General, because you have, over the past 14 years of your leadership in Paris, been capable of leading us in this way for all of us. So thank you for that effort. Thank you to the organization. Thank you to all of its teams who are here at our collective service. Thank you to all of the member states. And like you, I hope very much that the organization, this circle of goodwill, will continue to expand. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, President Macron. Plenty of food for thought there, which we will no doubt pick up on in our panel discussions a little bit later on. Do bear with us for just a few moments. We have to get a few things ready with the lectern and with the microphones and with the podium. Shouldn't take too long. We will be back with you shortly. All right, ladies and gentlemen, it now gives me great pleasure to give the floor to President Sanchez of Spain. President Sanchez, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Bonjour, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honor to be here together with my friends Emmanuel Macron and Angel Gurría on such a special occasion. Also Charles and the General Director of UNESCO. The OECD is a truly unique multilateral institution whose relevance and soft power has kept on growing, not least in the last 15 years under the leadership of Secretary-General Gurría. Not all institutions can say that their memberships continues to expand after 60 years of existence. The OECD was originally founded by 19 countries. Very soon, once Costa Rica formally joins the organization and after the addition of Colombia earlier this year, this number will have doubled. Very few institutions have been able to outlive their foundational goals and stay relevant, yet alone to increase their scope and usefulness. The OECD has managed all that and much more. It helped us realize the interdependence of our economies. It paved the way for a new era of cooperation in Europe and beyond. These things, things have changed substantially in these last 60 years. If someone had told our forefathers 60 years ago that Europeans would be using common debt to finance an ambitious recovery fund to tackle the second economic crisis in less than 10 years, they wouldn't have believed it. If they had heard that we are willing to shape the economy of the future after the disruptive pandemic through digitalization and the greatest geopolitical competition and green transition, they wouldn't have understood it. Yet, here we are. All along these 6 decades of progress and change, the OECD has remained a key forum for us to collectively identify problems, discuss and analyze them, and to promote policies to solve them. the OECD has emerged as a global influencer and facilitator of economic growth and well-being. One of the fundamental purposes of the OECD was to achieve the highest possible economic growth and employment levels and rising living standards in member countries. The organization has strived to reach this goal by formulating standards, by helping inform the policies of member countries, and above all, by advancing multilateralism. The ongoing development, at the request of Spain, of a transition strategy to restore the cross-border flows of people through international recognized and coordinated protocol is prime example of the OECD work for the shared benefit of its member countries. These protocols would enable safe international mobility despite the challenging sanitary environment until vaccines are fully rolled out and cross-border travel and tourism can go back to normal. The OECD is also the biggest multilateral think tank and global advisory body. Under the leadership of Secretary-General Gurría, new themes such as digitalization, inclusive growth, gender equality, and environmental care have entered the discourse of the OECD and through it of other international institutions. Now that his term is coming to an end, I want to explicitly acknowledge Angel Gurría's outstanding work and vision to steer this organization throughout all these years. But the OECD is also, as Sanchez said, increasingly becoming a global do tank, understanding specific tasks in the global multilateral system. Chief among them is the area of taxation, where this organization leads the effort to find a global compromise on a digital tax. Through development like this, the OECD has deepened its impact both geographically and in terms of norm setting, not by coercive means, but through best practices based on the rule of law and international fair play. My friends, for some, reaching 60 years of age means thinking about retirement. But that's not the case of the OECD. The 60th anniversary coming at a time of uncertainty and economic disruption should bring the OECD renewed energy to guide us through a recovery with a purpose. We face a critical time in our history in which the paradigm of the past, the idea that economic growth automatically trickles down to all sectors of society, is widely discredited. Across the developed world, we are witnessing a thinning of the middle class, increasingly precarious job conditions for blue-collar and platforms workers, and growing polarization in terms of income and wealth. All these trends occur as we have to fight the two biggest challenges of our time. First, to combat the COVID-19 and rebuild our economies. And second, to urgently step up the fight against climate crisis and environmental degradation that threaten life on our planet. This context requires a new growth model that combines equality of opportunity, including gender equality, social and territorial cohesion, technological innovation, and environmental sustainability. My government is fully committed to these goals, which represent the 4 acts of our recovery plans and policies, and which will also guide the EU policies and actions for the years to come. The statement that all the countries of the OECD signed together last October clearly spells out that we want a different model of economic growth, which integrates the fight against inequalities in our policies while we undertake a digital, a green, and an energy transition. Please allow me to share 3 key reflections on this emerging consensus, which have a sizable policy implication in our quest to build back better. The first, and contrary to the crowding out approach that prevailed in economic thinking for the last 3 decades, public investment and its crowding in effects should play a central role in this new economic paradigm. They are already a key component of the stimulus and recovery package that we will lay the foundation for a more resilient economy by supporting job-rich, highly productive and greener activities. The state will be the facilitators of all our sustainable development. The second reflection is that reducing inequalities is essential to achieve fair and inclusive growth, not only as an ethical or social justice issue, but also for economic efficiency and resilience, and for the overall health of our democracies. The COVID-19 crisis led to a worsening of wage inequality around the world, only partially offset by state-subsidized and minimum wage policies. Lower paid workers, disproportionately women, and the new precarious youth are the most affected by the rise in inequalities. It is time that labor regulations foster productivity through fair wage, decent working conditions, and enhanced social dialogue. It is time to make sure that no one is left behind. My government in Spain is firmly committed to reversing those trends. We have increased the minimum salaries, introduced a minimum living income for vulnerable families, and put in place short-time work and furlough schemes to protect jobs during the pandemic and beyond. We're reforming our education, our vocational training system to make it more inclusive, and working to eradicate the opportunity and pay gap between men and women. And we are set to adopt the most ambitious social and progressive budget in the history of my country. Third, renewed multilateral action will be crucial to implement this new paradigm, just as it is proving crucial in defeating COVID-19. This crisis should be an accelerator of reforms, both domestically and internationally. It should also accelerate and deepen our commitment to a level playing field, to a rules-based and fair multilateral trading system, and to tackle together long-lasting global challenges such as climate change, preserving biodiversity, or eradicating poverty. Because it is only if we all work together that we will successfully achieve our goals. All these emerging concepts are already present in our economic thinking. We're just at the beginning of a long process, but we know that the economic growth alone, it is not anymore the answer to attain well-being and prosperity for all. Economic growth is not just rate to reach. It should also have a direction, a clear purpose, improving the well-being of the majority of citizens, reducing inequalities, and transitioning to a decarbonized economy. Public investment and regulatory change are therefore needed. Progress means that the status quo will be challenged, but we shall prevail. The role of the OECD must continue to evolve to face these new challenges and deepen its role as the multilateral forum where new consensus are formulated and built. I am certain that the organization and all of you will be up to the task. As we celebrate the past, let us look to the future with optimism and determination. The world we deserve is in our hands. Dear colleagues, dear Angel, dear Emmanuel, I will not take more of your time. Let us now move to the first panel discussion precisely to exchange views on this emerging consensus. I'm very much looking forward. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, President Sanchez, and plenty of ideas there that will also help inform our first panel discussion, which I will get underway in just a moment. Give us 30 seconds or so just to move this podium one more time, do a little bit of cleaning, and then we will get underway. Plenty on the table, of course, lots of big ideas that we can ask the leaders about. Bear with us just for a few more seconds. Thank you very much indeed.